The clock struck the same time it always did. And just like every night before it, he was still awake. 6 years. Not a single night of unbroken rest. The city below moved in its usual rhythm, neon bleeding into rain-slicked streets, distant engines, the soft collapse of ordinary lives into sleep. None of it reached him. The glass between Kong Dae-hyun and the world was more than architectural. It was constitutional. He sat in the chair that faced the window. Not the desk. Not the bed. The chair because the desk meant work and the bed meant failure, and he had learned, somewhere between the 3rd and 4th year, to stop lying down and pretending. His left hand rested on the armrest. The ink across his knuckles caught the ambient light from the city. 5 characters, 1 per finger, a language of permanence written into skin. His forearm carried more. Denser. Darker. A sleeve of markings that climbed from wrist to elbow, each one a coordinate in a map of everything he had ever lost or promised or buried. He didn't look at them anymore. They were simply there. Like the insomnia. Like the silence. The house around him breathed in the absence of sound. 42 rooms, and the only one occupied at this hour was this one. Staff understood. No one moved through the east wing past 11. No one knocked without permission. No one asked questions about the lights that stayed on. That was the order of things. No one expected anything to change. No one expected it to begin with something as simple as a maid walking into the wrong room. Some stories don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, through a door left open by accident, through a face that shouldn't belong in a particular darkness. If you feel that pull already, follow it carefully. Share this with someone who needs to be unsettled in the best way. Subscribe, if the silence already has weight. Because from this moment, nothing in his world stays exactly where he left it. She arrived on a Tuesday. The agency sent 3 candidates. Dae-hyun's head of household staff, a meticulous man named Park Sung-jin, had reviewed their files with the same rigor applied to security clearances. He was not unkind. He was simply precise. The household required precision. 2 of the candidates were dismissed before noon, 1 for arriving 7 minutes late, 1 for making direct eye contact with the wrong person in the foyer. The third one waited. Her name was Zerim Becky. She sat in the staff reception room with her hands folded in her lap and her posture arranged in a way that suggested she had not chosen stillness. She had arrived there. There was a difference. Sung-jin noticed it. He didn't comment on it. She was in her late 20s. Light brown skin, the tone of warm wood in afternoon light. Her hair was wrapped in a dark scarf, neat, functional. She wore no jewelry. Her eyes, when she finally looked up at him, were dark and composed, and they moved over the room with the calibrated attention of someone accustomed to reading environments rather than decorating them. "You've worked in private households before," Sung-jin said. It wasn't a question. 4 years, she said. Her Korean was careful. Practiced, not perfect, but the structure was correct, and her accent carried something underneath it that he couldn't immediately place. Lagos first. Then London. Then here. You understand the terms of employment. I read them fully. There are additional terms not in the document. She waited. The East Wing is not part of your assigned duties. You will never enter it without explicit authorization. You will not speak to household members unless spoken to first. You will not ask questions about schedules, visitors, or absences. You will do your work, and you will do it without curiosity. Zuri held his gaze for a moment. Then she said simply, I understand. Sung-jin looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he set down her file. You start Thursday. The mansion occupied the upper tier of a private hill 20 minutes from central Seoul. It was not listed. It did not appear on maps accessible to ordinary people. The gate required 3 forms of clearance, and the men stationed there were not the decorative kind. Inside, it was immaculate. Not the cold immaculate of hotels or corporate lobbies, something more deliberate. Every surface had been chosen. Every light calibrated. Nothing was accidental, and nothing was soft. Zuri spent her first 2 days learning the layout from Mrs. O, the senior housekeeper who had worked there for 11 years and communicated primarily through directional gestures and brief, declarative sentences. The kitchen, this way. The linen storage. Here. The west courtyard, you may enter before 8. The gardens. Only with the schedule. And the east wing? Zuri asked, on the second day. Mrs. O's expression didn't shift. You were told about the east wing. I was. Then you don't need to know more about it. Zuri nodded. She committed the floor plan to memory, the way she committed everything, quietly, without appearing to. She was efficient. This was apparent within 48 hours. She moved through the household with an economy of motion that pleased Sung Jin without announcing itself. She didn't rearrange what had been established. She didn't create friction. She understood, apparently by instinct, that this was a house where the systems mattered more than the people who maintained them. What she didn't understand yet was who she was maintaining it for. She had seen him only once, on her second morning, from a distance of perhaps 15 meters. He was crossing the main corridor with 2 men she didn't recognize, both in dark suits, both with a particular posture of men who existed in someone else's orbit. He walked slightly ahead of them. Not hurried. Not slow. The pace of someone who had never needed to adjust their speed for another person. She was carrying linens. She stopped to the side, as Mrs. O had instructed. Eyes down, or at least angled away from direct contact. But she looked. Not at his face. Not directly. At the space around him. The way the corridor shifted slightly when he moved through it. The way the men with him created a slight asymmetry in their usual formation, as though proximity to him required constant, unconscious recalibration. He wore dark trousers and a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. The forearm tattoos were impossible not to notice. Not because they were displayed, they simply existed the way his silence did. Fully. He didn't look at her. She didn't expect him to. But as he passed, there was 1 second, half a second perhaps, where his pace fractionally, almost imperceptibly slowed. Then he was gone. Zuri adjusted the linens in her arms and continued down the corridor. On Friday night, her 4th night in residence, she made her first mistake. Not a careless one. That was important, in retrospect. The mistake was the product of thoroughness, which was, in the architecture of this particular household, its own kind of transgression. She had been tasked with taking inventory of the upper floor supply closets, a task that had apparently been deferred for several weeks. She worked her way methodically from west to east, cataloging items on the tablet she'd been issued, noting shortfalls and surplus with equal neutrality. The last closet on the list was at the end of a corridor she didn't immediately recognize as adjacent to the east wing. The floor plan she'd been given, she would later realize, had a subtle imprecision in this section. A deliberate one, she suspected. The closet itself was unremarkable. She entered, catalogued, finished. When she stepped back into the corridor, she turned the wrong direction. She realized it within 4 steps. The hallway felt different. The light changed quality, becoming something more like shadow with intention. The air was cooler. There was no sound, and the silence had a different texture than the rest of the house. She stopped. And then a door ahead of her opened. He stood in the doorway of what appeared to be a study. No, not a study. A room with a single lamp, a chair facing the window, a desk to one side with papers that were not in disarray but were clearly being used. The room of someone who worked in the dark. Kong Dae-hyun looked at her. Not with alarm. Not with anger. With the particular stillness of someone whose first reflex was never reaction. It was assessment. She didn't move. This seemed to be the correct response, because the thing in his expression didn't harden. "This wing is closed," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Controlled in a way that suggested effort wasn't required for it. This was simply the register of him. "I know," she said. "I made a directional error. I'm correcting it now." The silence that followed was perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. "The closet at the end," he said. "Inventory." "Yes. The floor plan is inaccurate in this section." She didn't say, "I suspected that." She said, "I'll note it." Another pause. His hand rested on the doorframe. The knuckle tattoos were visible, and up close, she could read one of the characters, though the others were angled away. His eyes hadn't moved from her. They were dark and precise and utterly unreadable. "You're the new staff," he said. "Yes." "How long?" 4 days. Something shifted in his expression. Nothing theatrical. A fraction of recalibration, as though that information had landed somewhere he hadn't expected it. "Go," he said. She turned and went. Her pulse did not visibly accelerate. Her hands did not tremble. But as she walked back down the correct corridor, she was aware, with a precision that matched her own professional standards, that something in those 14 seconds had registered in a part of her that did not default to professional neutrality. She filed it away. Then she finished the inventory. He stood in the doorway for 30 seconds after she disappeared. This was unusual. Dae-hyun was not a man who lingered in doorways. He was not a man who stood still for reasons he hadn't chosen. But for 30 seconds, he remained there, with the particular quality of attention he usually reserved for things that didn't add up. She hadn't flinched. Not when the door opened. Not when he spoke. Not at the silence, which most people, including several who had been in his organization for years, found difficult to inhabit without filling. She had simply stood there, answered his questions, and left. As though the encounter was entirely manageable. As though he was entirely manageable. He returned to his chair. The city lights shifted below. The clock on the wall read 1:47 a.m. He looked at it. Looked at the window. Looked at the ceiling. Nothing. The same nothing it had been for 6 years. The kind of wakefulness that wasn't alertness. It was exhaustion that had simply learned to stop asking for resolution. The doctors had names for it. He had stopped seeing the doctors after the 2nd year. The medications created a different problem, a fog that was worse than the wakefulness because at least when he was awake, he was still himself. He could not afford to not be himself. So he sat. He worked. He waited for the hours to pass the way some men wait for weather, knowing it will change eventually, knowing he has no hand in when. Tonight, as on most nights, the stack of documents on the desk required his attention. He rose from the chair and went to them. Reports from 3 different cells. A situation in Busan developing in a direction that required intervention. Financial movements that needed his signature and his understanding. He worked until 4. At 4 he poured 2 fingers of scotch he wouldn't fully drink and returned to the chair. The city below began the earliest stage of its pre-dawn transition. The shift workers, the delivery routes, the first grey suggestion of light on the eastern skyline. He thought, briefly and without intention, about the way she'd said "I'll note it." Not "I'm sorry." Not a deflection or a show of submission. Just a statement of what she would do next. He pressed his thumb against the tattoo on his opposite wrist. An old habit. Then he stopped. He did not think about her again. Or told himself that, which was a different thing. The following week established a rhythm. Zuri's assigned areas kept her in the west and central portions of the house. She cleaned. She stocked. She managed the linen rotation and coordinated with the kitchen staff on the schedules she'd been given. She was good at the job, not performatively good, just genuinely efficient, with the kind of attention to detail that required no supervision because she supervised herself. Mrs. O, who was not given to commentary, told Sung-jin on Wednesday, "She doesn't miss things." Sung-jin passed this observation to no one, but noted it in his mental register. What no one noticed, because no one was looking for it, was that Zuri was learning the house, not its systems. She'd learned those in the first 3 days. She was learning its patterns. The way certain staff appeared and disappeared on irregular schedules. The vehicles that arrived without announcement. The section of the kitchen that was used at unusual hours. The way the east wing lights behaved, visible from the central garden, at times when the rest of the house was dark. She didn't ask questions. She observed. There was a discipline to it that she had developed long before she arrived here, in households far more volatile than this one, and it had kept her employed and intact. She was not naive about what this household was. The files she'd read before applying, the ones that her agency had provided, which were thorough in what they said and revealing in what they didn't, had told her enough. What they hadn't told her was whether it mattered, given that she needed the income and was very good at managing environments that required absolute professional discretion. It didn't conflict with her values. She cleaned houses. She didn't clean consciences. On Thursday, she was assigned to the East Wing for the first time. Not the full wing, only the corridor adjacent to it, which connected to the main staircase and required weekly maintenance. Sung Jin briefed her personally on what was permitted. The corridor itself. Nothing beyond the third door. She was to complete it quickly and leave. She did exactly that. Except that she was fast. Faster than the time allotted. And in the remaining 4 minutes, she stood near the window at the corridor's end, which looked into a portion of the east courtyard she hadn't seen before. He was in it. Standing at the far edge, near a stone wall half covered in dead vine. He wasn't on a phone. He wasn't speaking to anyone. He was simply standing in the cold morning air. It was barely 8, with his hands at his sides and his face turned slightly upward. His shirt was dark, untucked. From this distance she could see the suggestion of a marking at his collarbone, just above the open top button, though she couldn't read it. He looked exhausted. Not physically. His posture was too controlled for that. It was something in the stillness. The kind of stillness that wasn't chosen because it was peaceful. The kind that existed because the alternative had long since stopped being an option. She had seen that kind of stillness before. Once, in her own mirror, at a particular point in her own history that she did not revisit unnecessarily. She stepped back from the window. Finished her work. Left. He saw her at the window. He didn't turn to face it directly. He had learned, across years of professional survival, never to appear to notice what he was noticing. But in his peripheral vision, the shape of her at the glass registered with a clarity he didn't expect. She wasn't watching him the way people watched him. That particular gaze, the one that carried either calculation or fear or both, he could identify at 40 meters. It had a quality. A weight. She was watching the way someone watches something that made them think of something else. He didn't know that with certainty. It was an inference. But Dae-hyun's inferences were not usually wrong. He let the moment pass. Counted 10 seconds. Then looked toward the window. She was already gone. He stood in the courtyard for another 4 minutes. The cold helped sometimes. Not with sleep. Nothing helped with sleep, but with the clarity that substituted for it. The cold was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything. He went back inside. That afternoon, he asked Sung Jin, without preamble, without context, about the new staff member. Sung Jin provided the summary efficiently. Name, background, performance assessment, notable qualities. He mentioned Mrs. O's observation. She doesn't speak unnecessarily, Sung Jin added, as though this were a practical feature rather than a character note. I know, Dae-hyun said. Sung Jin waited to see if there was a question. There wasn't. Dae-hyun returned to his documents, and Sung Jin left. That night, the Tuesday of her second week, Dae-hyun sat in his chair until 2:30. The documents were finished. The city was deep in its middle-of-the-night silence. He had done what he always did, worked until there was nothing left to work on, then sat and waited for a sleep that operated on its own unaccountable schedule. At 2:40, his phone vibrated. A message from one of his lieutenants, a development in Busan, earlier than expected. He read it, composed his response, put the phone down. At 2:53, something shifted in the quality of his wakefulness. It wasn't sleep. He knew sleep, distantly, the way a person knows a language they once spoke fluently and have since half forgotten. This was something adjacent to it. A weight in the space behind his eyes. A slowing. He didn't move. He was afraid, the way a man who has stopped hoping allows himself to be afraid of hoping, that if he moved, it would leave. At 3:11, he was asleep in the chair. Not deeply. Not cleanly. But the city below disappeared behind his eyes, and the weight of the hours let go for the first time in. He couldn't count precisely without it mattering too much. He slept for 40 minutes. When he woke, the first grey of pre-dawn was at the edge of the sky. He sat with the residue of it, the 40 minutes, with a kind of stunned unfamiliarity. Then he got up, made coffee, stood at the kitchen counter alone, tried to understand what had been different about tonight. He couldn't find it. But that afternoon, without knowing why, he found himself pausing near the east corridor window that looked into the west garden, where, at that hour, he knew the new staff member would be managing the outdoor maintenance. He didn't stand there long. Just long enough. She found the book on the 14th day. It was in the supply closet adjacent to the main staircase, a large, leather-bound volume wedged between stacks of linen that clearly hadn't been moved in some time. She almost didn't pull it out. It wasn't her business. She pulled it out. It wasn't a journal. It was a book of poetry, Korean, traditional, printed in a format that suggested some age. The cover had no title visible from the outside. The spine was cracked in a way that indicated it had been opened at the same page repeatedly. She opened it to that page. The poem was short. 12 lines. She could read enough Korean to get the structure of it, if not every nuance. It was about a particular kind of waiting, not patient waiting, but the waiting that is itself a form of suffering. The word that appeared 3 times, which she knew, was sleep. She stood with the book for longer than she should have. Then she placed it back exactly where she had found it, in the exact position, and finished her work. That evening, she sat in the small room that had been assigned to her in the staff quarters. It was spare and clean and entirely functional. She had added nothing to it, no photographs, no decoration. She'd learned the value of living lightly in spaces that didn't belong to her. She thought about the book. About the cracked spine at the page with the word for sleep repeated 3 times. About a man standing in a cold courtyard at 8 in the morning with a stillness that wasn't rest. She thought about these things with the part of her mind she reserved for information that didn't yet have a category. She was patient with uncategorized information. It usually found its place eventually. Then she turned off the light and went to sleep. Easily. Without effort. The way she always had since she was a child. The ability to release the day and go under. A gift she had never quite appreciated until she was in a household where its absence was practically architectural. On the 16th day, she walked into the room where he was sitting. This time, it was not a mistake. She had been asked by Sung-jin, with slightly unusual specificity, to bring a late tray to the East Wing study. Not the forbidden interior room. The outer study, adjacent to the corridor she'd been cleared for. Sung-jin gave her the tray and the instructions and did not explain why the usual protocol for food delivery had been suspended for this particular evening. She carried the tray without question. The study door was open. He was at the desk. Documents spread in controlled arrangement. The single lamp made the room feel like the only lit place in the world. She entered, set the tray on the designated surface with 0 excess sound, and began to leave. Becky. She stopped. Turned. He hadn't looked up from the documents. His pen moved across the page he was reading. A notation, she thought, from the posture of his hand. Then it stopped. "You've been here 16 days, he said. "Yes. And you haven't asked a single question that wasn't directly task relevant." She waited, because this didn't seem to require a response yet. Most staff ask 3 questions in the first week that they shouldn't. He set the pen down. Looked up. His eyes, in the lamplight, were dark and preternaturally still. "You asked none. I was told what I needed to know. That's not why." His voice was measured. People who stay quiet because they were told to stay quiet have a particular quality about them. You don't have it. She regarded him with the same composure she had apparently brought to this household as a fixed trait. I don't find unnecessary questions useful, she said. The house tells me what I need to know, if I pay attention. Something moved across his expression. Small. Unnameable. And what has it told you? He asked. She understood with the intelligence that lived in her posture, that this was both a test and something else. That he was asking with a precision that expected a precise answer, but that there was something underneath the precision that was not entirely interrogation. That this is a house where stillness is the primary language, she said. And that it keeps that language for a reason. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 6 seconds. Dae-hyun looked at her for all 6 of them. Leave the tray, he said. And don't use the inaccurate floor plan again. I'll have the correct one sent to your room. She inclined her head, fractionally. Thank you. She left. And this time in the corridor, she allowed herself one full breath of something she would not have named aloud. Behind her, in the study, Kong Dae-hyun looked at the space where she had stood for a moment that was almost imperceptible. Then he picked up his pen. That night, he slept for 1 hour and 17 minutes. Still in the chair. Still with the lamp on. But 1 hour and 17 minutes. And when he woke, the city outside was doing the particular blue thing it did in the deepest part of night, and the silence in the room had a different quality than it usually did. He sat with it. Didn't try to name it. Just let it exist in the room with him, the way something had entered and changed the air without announcing itself. The way, he thought, despite not wanting to think it, a certain presence had arrived in this house 14 days ago and rearranged something in its atmosphere without touching a single wall. He looked at the tray she'd brought. Drank the tea. It was exactly the right temperature. He did not know how that was possible, given the timing, and he did not ask. He didn't ask unnecessary questions either. The correct floor plan arrived in her room the following morning. It was slipped under her door before 6, before she was awake, which told her it had been arranged the night before. She unfolded it carefully and studied it for 10 minutes over her morning tea. The inaccuracy in the east wing had been corrected with a simple revision mark in red ink, very precise, the kind made by someone accustomed to reading architectural documents. She refolded it, placed it on her table, went to work. That day, and for the next several days, nothing changed visibly. She maintained her assignments. She maintained her silence. The household ran with the same controlled rhythm it always had, and her position within it became, by the 3rd week, unremarkably established, which was exactly what she wanted. What changed was smaller than any of it would have appeared from the outside. He stopped leaving the study before she arrived with the evening tray. This was notable because, for the first 3 deliveries, the study had been empty when she arrived. The instructions had been to leave the tray on the designated surface and go. On the 4th delivery, he was there. On the 5th. On the 6th. He rarely spoke. Sometimes, nothing at all. Just the scratch of his pen and the ambient awareness of another person in the room who was not a threat and was not a supplicant. Sometimes a single sentence. Once, on the 8th delivery, too. The Busan development resolved, he said, without preamble. Without context she was supposed to have. Earlier than projected. She set the tray down. Didn't ask what Busan development meant. Said, that must be a relief. He looked at her. It's a continuation, he said. Not a resolution. She nodded, once. And left. She thought about that exchange later, the distinction he'd drawn. Continuation, not resolution. The precision of it. The way it applied, she suspected, to more than Busan. The incident with Han Ji-soo happened on a Thursday in the 4th week. Han Ji-soo was one of 3 men who held significant positions in Dae-hyun's inner structure. Not the ones who appeared in public-facing roles, but the ones whose job was to manage the particular problems that required a certain kind of management. He was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, with the deliberate physicality of someone who had spent years ensuring people understood what he could do. He had, on 2 occasions in Zuri's first 2 weeks, looked at her in a way that was professionally inappropriate. She had noted it. Said nothing. Adjusted her routes to minimize intersection. On the Thursday of the 4th week, this became impossible to avoid. She was in the main corridor with a supply cart when he came around the corner and stopped. She moved the cart to one side to let him pass. He didn't pass. He stood in the middle of the corridor with the particular stance of someone who had determined that they were not in a hurry. "You're the African girl," he said, in Korean that was slightly too loud for the space. "I'm the housekeeper," she said. He smiled. It didn't reach anything behind it. "Where are you from originally?" "I'm working. I'm asking a question." She met his gaze for exactly 1 second. Not submission, not challenge, just flat acknowledgement, then turned her attention back to the cart. "I need to finish this corridor." He stepped into her path. "I'm not finished." What happened next she would not, afterward, describe as frightening, because the clinical portion of her mind was cataloging options before the emotional portion had processed the situation. She was aware of the distance between them, the width of the corridor, the approximate location of the nearest occupied room. She was aware of the careful neutral expression she was maintaining, and what it cost, and why it was still the correct choice. She was also aware, without turning, of the presence at the far end of the corridor. Dae-hyun had a way of occupying space that preceded his actual arrival, a shift in the atmosphere, the way a pressure change announces weather. She'd learned to recognize it in the past weeks, without having consciously decided to learn it. He came around the corner and stopped. Hon Ji-soo turned. The corridor went entirely silent. Dae-hyun looked at Hon Ji-soo for perhaps 4 seconds. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't alter his expression. The economy of his attention was its own form of devastation, the absolute removal of everything that wasn't the precise point. "You're in the wrong building," Dae-hyun said. "The debrief is at the East office." Hon Ji-soo's posture changed. Something collapsed inward, quietly, without any visible dramatics. "I was." "The East office," Dae-hyun repeated. "Same register. Softer, even. Now." Hon Ji-soo left. Dae-hyun's eyes moved to Zuri. She was already looking at him. Had been since he appeared at the end of the corridor, though she'd kept the angle oblique. He looked at her for a moment. "Continue," he said, and walked away. She continued. The supply cart moved with the same efficiency it always did. Her hands did not falter on the inventory she was completing. But that evening, in her room, she sat on the edge of her bed for 7 minutes and let herself feel the full weight of the afternoon in a way she hadn't permitted herself in the corridor. Not fear. She'd moved past that category for moments like this a long time ago. Something adjacent to the recognition that she was in a house with real power arranged around her in all directions, and that some of that power had, today, moved in her direction without being asked. She didn't know what to do with that. She decided not to do anything with it yet. He had Hon Ji-soo transferred to an operation in Daegu by Saturday. He didn't explain this decision to anyone. He rarely explained decisions. The directive went through Sung-jin, who communicated it with the same absence of editorializing he brought to everything, and that was the end of it. That night, Dae-hyun slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Again in the chair. But 2 hours and 40 minutes. More than he'd accumulated in the preceding 48 hours combined. He woke with a particular shock of having gone further than he'd expected, the way you might catch your foot on a step you thought you'd cleared. He sat in the dark for a while. The lamp was off. He'd fallen asleep without turning it off, which was unusual. He normally maintained the lamp as a kind of anchor, something that said this is still work, this is still wakefulness. Without it, the room was different. Less like a space he'd built defenses in. More like just a room. He found he didn't immediately turn it back on. He sat in the dark for 20 minutes, which was the longest he'd spent in unlit silence in years, and the dark was not comfortable, but it was. He searched for the word, bearable in a way it hadn't been. Then he turned the lamp on. Looked at his papers. Didn't reach for them. Instead, he looked at the window. Outside, across the grounds, the staff quarters were fully dark. The regular hours. He had never thought much about the staff quarters. They were a functional part of the household's operation, appropriately managed, appropriately arranged. He thought about them now, briefly and without permitting himself to know exactly why. Then he opened the first document. She began to understand the rhythm of his sleeplessness by accident. It was the lights. She had developed over the weeks a practitioner's relationship with the house's patterns. Which lights were on when, what they meant, what the deviations indicated. The East Wing study was the variable. Every other room operated on predictable schedules. That room ran on whatever schedule his wakefulness dictated. She never looked deliberately. But her room's small window faced in the correct direction, and when she woke in the night, which she sometimes did, from old habits of light sleeping learned in less safe places, she could see whether the study lamp was burning. It almost always was. On the nights she'd slept particularly well, she sometimes lay awake for a few minutes in the warm dark and thought, without judgment and without quite knowing what to do with the thought, about the quality of exhaustion she'd seen in his courtyard stillness. The kind that lives not in the body but somewhere further in. She had her own version of it, from a different source, long since metabolized into something manageable. She was not the same as him. She didn't map their experiences onto each other. But she knew what it looked like, from the inside, to be someone the night wouldn't give back to. On a Wednesday in the 5th week, she did something she did not plan. She had finished the evening tray delivery, which by now had acquired an unspoken consistency, a routine that no one had explicitly formalized but that had simply become the shape of that hour. She was leaving. He hadn't spoken. She stopped at the doorway. "There's a tea blend," she said, "that I sometimes make for," she paused. Chose the next words carefully. "When I have difficulty sleeping." He looked up. "It's not medicinal," she said. "Just particular. Chamomile base with 2 additional things. I can leave the components in the kitchen if you want them available. You don't have to use them." The silence was his primary language, and she'd learned to read some of its dialects. This particular silence was not dismissal. It was something she couldn't fully name yet, a stillness with a texture she hadn't encountered from him before. "What are the 2 additional things?" he said. "Dried lemon verbena. And a small amount of ashwagandha root." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not suspicion. She'd seen that in him, and it was distinct. "Where did you come across that combination?" "My grandmother," she said. "She used to say that sleep doesn't respond to being chased. It has to believe you've stopped looking." The silence that came after this was different from any she'd been in with him. Longer. Heavier, but not threatening. The kind that forms when something lands somewhere it wasn't expected to land. Then, "Leave the components," he said. She left. He didn't use them that night. He looked at the small wrapped bundle that appeared in his kitchen the next morning with the expression he applied to things he wasn't sure about. Flat, attentive, giving nothing away. Sung Jin, to his credit, said nothing about it. He used them on the 3rd night. He was not optimistic. He approached the preparation with the brisk pragmatism he applied to everything. Boiled water, measured the components as she'd written on the small card left with the bundle, waited the specified time. The result looked like tea. It smelled like something from a different kind of quiet than he was used to. He drank it at the desk, working. At some point after 1 in the morning, he became aware that the particular hum behind his eyes, the one that had been his constant companion for 6 years, the frequency of sustained wakefulness, had shifted in register. Not disappeared, but lowered. He moved to the chair. He was asleep before 2. He slept for 4 hours and 12 minutes. When he woke, the light outside was the particular silver gray of early morning that he associated with the very few full nights he could remember from the years before. The years when sleep had not been remarkable, had simply been a thing that happened, unremarkable and regular, like breathing. 4 hours and 12 minutes was not a full night. But it was the longest he had slept in 6 years. He sat in the chair for a long time afterward. The city was beginning its dawn routine below. The staff quarters would be stirring. He was aware, with a specificity that he applied careful analysis to, that somewhere in this house, a woman who knew something about sleep that he apparently didn't had laid down the previous night and gone under easily. He pressed the heel of his palm against his knee. 4 hours and 12 minutes. He did not permit himself to identify the feeling this produced. He noted it, placed it in a category without a label, moved forward. But that morning, when he passed Sung Jin in the corridor and Sung Jin gave him the standard status report, Dae-hyun looked slightly different than he had in any of the preceding several years. Sung Jin noticed this without commenting on it, in the way of someone who knows better than to point at a wound while it's healing. The nights began to shift. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have been obvious to anyone watching from the outside. But the study lamp went off earlier on certain nights. The pace of work through the household, which was calibrated to his schedule, everything arranged in his wake, registered a subtle change that Sung Jin filed in the same mental category as the other thing he wasn't commenting on. She continued the evening deliveries. The tea components were replenished twice, both times appearing in the kitchen via the ordered supply without anyone having explicitly requested them in conversation. She assumed Sung Jin handled it. She didn't ask. What changed between her and Dae-hyun was also not dramatic. It was the length of the silence before she left. In the beginning, she would set down the tray and be in the doorway within 90 seconds. Now, sometimes, she was still in the room at 4 minutes. Not because she was slow. Because he hadn't released the space yet. Some quality of the air in those evenings held a different tension than the clinical efficiency of the earlier weeks. He would speak, occasionally. Fragments, mostly. Observations that existed without preamble and didn't necessarily expect a response. She learned quickly which ones were thinking aloud and which were directed at her. The directed ones were rare. She answered them with her particular economy, and he received the answers with his. Once he said, "You came from London before this." "Yes." "Why Seoul?" She considered this. "It's a new language," she said. "I like learning new languages." "Languages," he said. "Not Korean specifically." "The language of a city," she said. "How it moves. What it says when it's quiet." He looked at her for a long moment. "And what does this city say?" "I'm still learning that part," she said. He returned to his documents. But before she reached the doorway, he said, without looking up, "It says less than people expect." She paused. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it worth learning." The shift in power, the one that cracked something open in the 5th week's final days, came from a direction neither of them had arranged. It was Sung Jin who delivered the information, on a Friday morning, in the terse manner of someone reporting a security matter rather than a personal one. "There is an inquiry," he said to Dae-hyun, "into the household staff, originating externally." He paused, in the way Sung Jin paused when the next sentence required more care than the previous one. "The subject of the inquiry is Mbeki." Dae-hyun set down his coffee. Source. Not confirmed. Methodology suggests independent investigative firm. Possibly commissioned. Commissioned by. Unknown. We're developing it. Dae-hyun was quiet for a moment. This was not the silence of someone who didn't know what to do. This was the stillness of someone rapidly aligning several moving pieces into a coherent picture. "What is the inquiry focused on?" he asked. "Her employment history. Prior residences. Lagos specifically." Sung Jin's expression remained neutral. "There is also a secondary inquiry running in parallel into the Lagos period that appears to predate her employment here." Dae-hyun looked at him for a moment. "You're telling me this because if someone is running background on household staff with an investigative firm of this caliber, the target is not necessarily the staff member." The implication was clear. An inquiry into someone in his household of this depth, from a source not yet identifiable, could be leverage building. Not about her. About him. Or, and this was the second possibility Sung Jin was too careful to say plainly, It could be genuinely about her. In which case, there was something in Zerim Becky's past that someone was willing to pay for. Keep the development running, Dae-hyun said. Don't move on it yet. And the staff member? Dae-hyun looked at the window. She stays, he said. She continues her work. Nothing changes for her today. Understood. She noticed it the following evening. She couldn't have said exactly what it was. The air in the study had the same temperature, the lamp burned at its usual angle, the tray was the same configuration. But when she set it down and turned to leave, he spoke immediately. Sit down, he said. She hadn't been offered a seat in this room before. She looked at the chair across from the desk, the one that existed in the room without having apparently been used for anything. Its placement suggested it was there less for guests and more as a formal acknowledgement that the concept of guests existed. She sat. He watched her do it with an expression she couldn't read, but which carried something she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite concern. Something more guarded than that. The face of someone about to say something they're not certain is correct strategy. Tell me about Lagos, he said. The room adjusted around the question. She didn't let her posture change. She was good at that, the body as its own form of information management. But her hands, which had been resting on her knees, settled differently. A fractional shift. What about it, she said. The household you worked in. The 4 years. What ended it? She looked at him. Held that for a moment. You've been investigating me, she said. It wasn't an accusation. Just a placement of fact. Someone is, he said. Which is a different problem, depending on where it originates. The clarity of this, the bluntness of it, produced a response in her she hadn't entirely expected. Not anger. Something more like the particular relief that comes from having information you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. She understood now why the air had been different when she walked in. What do you need to know, she said. What you're not telling me, he said. Which is something. I've known that since the first week. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the study window, the grounds were settling into evening. Somewhere in the house, the kitchen staff was completing the last rotation of the day. The ordinary machinery of the household, proceeding. The man I worked for in Lagos, she began. He was not, she paused. Selected. The household had connections to people who operated outside legal structures. I didn't know the full extent when I took the position. When I understood it, I had already been there long enough that leaving required more calculation than simply resigning. What happened when you left? I took the correct documentation. Employment records, references, legal copies of everything I was entitled to. Nothing else. She met his eyes. But leaving a household like that, leaving correctly, without giving them a reason to complicate it, requires a particular kind of patience. It took 8 months to arrange. And after you left? After I left, there was a period where I believed I would be followed. I wasn't, ultimately. But that belief required me to move carefully. London was chosen for the distance. Seoul was chosen for the same reason, additionally. Dae-hyun was still. The kind of stillness she'd come to understand was active, not passive. His mind was working behind the composed exterior with a precision that she felt across the desk. The man in Lagos, he said. His name. She told him. He didn't react to the name. But something in his jaw, not a muscle movement exactly, more like a settled certainty, told her the name was not unknown to him. You knew who you were coming to work for, he said. It was not an accusation either. Simply the placement of fact. I knew you operated outside particular boundaries, she said. I knew you were established, controlled, and unlikely to create the kind of chaos that makes a household unsafe. I also knew, she paused again. I knew that someone of your reputation doesn't tolerate staff who don't do their jobs correctly. Which gave me a cleaner framework to operate in than the one I left. The silence lasted. Then, that's an unusual way to choose an employer, he said. It's an accurate one, she said. He looked at her across the desk for a long moment. The lamplight was doing something to the room, making it feel more bounded, more sealed from the rest of the house than it usually did. As though the conversation had created its own perimeter. "The inquiry," he said finally. "I'll find its source. You should know that someone is running background on your Lagos period with significant resources." "Do you know why?" she asked. "Not yet." A pause. "When I do, I'll tell you." She looked at him. Something passed through her, complicated, warm, alarming in its warmth, at the fact of those 4 words. "I'll tell you." The assumption of a continuing relationship. The assumption that she had a right to information about her own situation. "Thank you," she said. "It's not generosity," he said. "I need to know what's moving near my house." "I know," she said. "Thank you anyway." He looked at her. That unnameable thing moved through his expression again. "You can go," he said. She left. In the corridor, she moved with the same controlled efficiency as always. But her mind was running on 2 tracks. The practical one, cataloging what she'd said and what he'd received and what the next correct moves were. And beneath it, quieter, the track that was processing the fact that she had just told the most truthful version of herself she'd offered any employer since Lagos. She didn't know entirely why she'd done that. She suspected, in the part of her that was honest with herself in the small hours, that the reason had something to do with the way he'd looked at her when he said, "Someone is," which is a different problem depending on where it originates. He'd been concerned about where it originated. About the distinction. Not simply about the fact of it. She filed this in the same uncategorized folder she'd been maintaining since the first week. It was getting full. He didn't sleep that night. Not the tea's failure, he'd had the tea. It was something else. The particular wakefulness that comes not from anxiety but from a kind of heightened consciousness, the mind running too clearly to allow the lower registers to take over. He worked. The Busan continuation. 3 other matters. His hand moved across documents with the same fluid precision as always. But every 40 minutes or so, he would stop. Look at the window. Think about nothing for approximately 30 seconds. Then return. What he was actually doing, he was aware, was processing. He processed in this way, the document-punctuated rumination, when something had arrived in a form he hadn't planned for. His mind needed to move around it, look at it from multiple angles, understand what it actually was before he decided how to respond. What he was processing was this. She had not been afraid of him. In the full conversation, with everything the conversation contained. His knowledge of her, the implicit acknowledgement of the inquiry, the disclosure of Lagos. She had not once carried herself like someone who needed to manage his opinion of her. She had been honest in a way that wasn't vulnerable. It was the honesty of someone who had moved past the cost of it. Who had already paid, in some previous life, whatever price honesty extracted, and had come out the other side with a preference for it. He had not expected that. He had not expected, when he asked her to sit, to find himself in a conversation with someone who spoke to him. Not at him, not around him, not carefully away from him, but to him, with the same directness he used with people who had earned it. He pressed his thumb against the tattoo at his wrist again. The character for memory. He'd stopped being aware of doing it years ago. He became aware of it now. He thought about what she'd said. Sleep doesn't respond to being chased. It has to believe you've stopped looking. He thought about what the 6 years had been. In what sense? Whether the insomnia was the wound or the symptom. He thought about these things and didn't resolve them, because resolution was not a thing the night offered him on its schedule. But at some point before dawn, he lay down on the low couch in the study's corner, something he hadn't done in years, had almost forgotten existed as an option, and pulled the single blanket over himself. He didn't expect sleep. He closed his eyes and let the darkness be what it was. He slept for 3 hours. On the couch. Not the chair. In the morning, he sat up, and the first thing he was aware of was the quality of light through the window, which was fuller than he usually saw it, and the fact that his neck ached in a way that suggested he'd been deeply enough under not to move. He sat with this for a while. Then he got up, made coffee, stood at the window. The grounds below were beginning their morning activity. The kitchen staff was visible at the far end. The garden maintenance crew was moving along the east courtyard. And there, crossing the central path with a supply cart, her dark scarf catching the morning light, was Zerim Becky, moving through the morning with a particular calm efficiency she brought to everything. She stopped at a turn in the path, looked up. He was standing at the window, not concealed, not performing absence. She looked at him for a moment, 2 maybe. Then she continued with the cart. He remained at the window for another 30 seconds. The coffee in his hand had cooled. He didn't notice. The source of the inquiry was identified on a Tuesday. Sung Jin delivered the report in person, door closed, in the particular mode he adopted when information required the room. Dae-hyun listened without interruption, then asked 2 questions, then sat with the answers. The investigative firm had been commissioned by a man named Choi Byung-suk, a name Dae-hyun knew with the familiarity of sustained professional grievance. Choi operated in the adjacent territory, not under Dae-hyun, not opposed to him in open terms, but operating in the particular gray space of someone who needed leverage and collected it the way other men collected insurance. The Lagos connection was what Choi was using as the thread. The man Zuri had worked for in Lagos, whose name Dae-hyun had recognized immediately, had a secondary connection to one of Dae-hyun's past business arrangements. One from the early years, before his organization had achieved the current clarity of its structure. An arrangement that had been dissolved cleanly but whose paper history, if read correctly by someone motivated to read it, could suggest an ongoing relationship that did not exist. Choi was building toward something, using her past as the thread to pull at his present. It was elegant, as these things went. Dae-hyun had to concede that. Use the household staff as a pressure point. Either she was dirty and could be leveraged, or she wasn't, and the inquiry itself was the disturbance, the implication, the suggestion of exposure that would make his organization nervous. Either way, Choi won a small thing. Unless Dae-hyun moved first. The secondary inquiry into Lagos, Dae-hyun said. What did it produce? Very little that she hadn't already told you, Sung Jin said, with the careful neutrality of someone who was aware that this statement implied a comparison. Her departure was exactly as she described. The 8 months. The documentation. She left cleanly. And Choi's use of her. Indirect, so far. He's still building the file. He hasn't made contact. He won't have time to, Dae-hyun said. Sung Jin waited. I'll handle Choi through the financial channel. He has 3 open positions in his operation that require structural patience to hold. We remove that patience. He'll be occupied with internal problems within 2 weeks, and the inquiry will lose its funding. He paused. That's the first part. The second part, he looked at Sung Jin. She needs to know the specifics. She's household staff, Sung Jin said. Not an objection. An observation. She's a person whose name is being used in my house, Dae-hyun said. She told me the truth about Lagos. I told her I would tell her what I found. Sung Jin absorbed this. His expression suggested he was filing the statement in the same folder where he'd filed the changed lamp schedule and the appearance of herbal tea components in the kitchen. The folder he was never going to open out loud. I'll arrange it, he said. He told her himself. He didn't send Sung Jin. He also didn't stage it for the evening delivery. He sent for her at an unusual hour mid-afternoon, and when she arrived at the study, the desk was clear of documents and he was standing at the window rather than sitting. She read the room. Said nothing. Waited. He told her about Choi. About the Lagos thread and the structure of what was being built. He was direct in the way he was direct about everything. Cleanly, without softening it into something smaller than it was, but also without amplifying it. He gave her the information she needed to understand the situation. Nothing performed. Nothing withheld. She listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, What do you need from me? Nothing, he said. This is my problem to manage. I'm telling you because it is also your name. She looked at him. And because you told me the truth, he said, when I asked. The stillness in the room shifted. She had learned, over the weeks, to read the various dialects of his silence. This one was not the sealed silence he maintained with the rest of the household. This one had an opening in it. A small and careful opening, but there. Choi, she said. He's going to stop. Yes. And the inquiry will run out of support within 2 weeks. Possibly sooner. He looked at her with the dark, precise attention she'd become, she realized, uncomfortably familiar with. You're not in danger. You weren't in danger here. I want that clear. I know, she said. Then, I knew that before today. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression. How? Because this house has a particular relationship with risk, she said. It's not reckless. It's controlled. And controlled environments don't generate collateral damage by accident. When someone here is harmed, it's a choice. She paused. You haven't chosen that. He looked at her with an attention that was not the professional calibration she'd become used to. It was something else. More direct. More difficult to be in the path of. No, he said. I haven't. She stood at a distance of perhaps 4 feet from him. The afternoon light was doing something different than the lamp. It was wider, more honest, and it illuminated things that lamplight tended to soften. The lines of exhaustion that lived permanently beneath his composure. The collarbone marking, just visible above his open collar. The weight in him that had not lifted, even with the incremental change in his sleep that she was aware of without having been told. She said before she'd fully decided to say it, "Are you sleeping more?" The question landed. He received it without deflecting it. Some nights, he said. The tea. And other things, he said. And then, in the closest register to admission she'd heard from him, I don't know how to explain it. She didn't push it. She understood. The explanation wasn't available, possibly not to him and certainly not in this room yet. The moment carried what it carried, and any move to amplify it would collapse it. You don't have to, she said. She left soon after, as she always did. The corridor. The cart. The rest of the afternoon. But she carried those 4 words back with her, and other things, and placed them in the folder that was very full now, and had not been opened, and was becoming, she understood, a problem of a particular kind. On the last day of the 6th week, the thing that had been building in the invisible register of the house arrived at its first physical threshold. It was late, after 10, the time when the household had generally completed its evening operations. She was finishing the east corridor, which had become part of her regular assignment by unspoken extension. Efficient work. Quiet movement. The usual. She came around the turn near the study and found the door open and him standing just inside it, facing away from her toward the window. She stopped. She could have retreated. He hadn't seen her, or hadn't appeared to. But she didn't retreat. She stood in the doorway, aware of the particular geometry of the moment, and waited to see what it resolved into. He turned. He'd known she was there, she understood immediately. The turn was not startled. It was simply the moment when acknowledgement became mutual. He looked at her. She looked at him. The house breathed around them. You're done for the night, he said. Almost. Finish tomorrow, he said. Come in. She came in. It was different from the tray deliveries. More deliberate on both sides, the crossing of the threshold carrying weight that the usual function-driven entries hadn't. She stood a few feet into the room and didn't advance further, giving the moment its space. Sit, he said. Then, looking at the desk chair and the other chair. Not there. Here. He indicated the couch in the corner, the one she hadn't seen him use, hadn't known was used. She sat on one end of it. He remained standing for a moment, then, in a movement that seemed almost to happen without his planning it, sat on the other end. There was a significant distance between them. Appropriate. But the quality of the space was different from across a desk. Less structured. Less defended. He said, "You're from Lagos originally." "Originally from Ibadan," she said. "Lagos was where I worked." "And before Lagos?" She looked at him. The question had layers, and he was asking all of them at once in his economical way. "Before Lagos," she said, "there was a version of me that made different choices about what was safe to trust. Some of them didn't work out. I recalibrated." "How long did that take?" "Longer than I would have liked. Less long than it could have." He was quiet. His hands rested on his knees. She could see the knuckle tattoos, the forearm markings, the particular stillness of hands that held a great deal of controlled force and were choosing not to express it. 6 years, he said. For me. He said it without transition or explanation. But she understood entirely what he was marking. The bookend. The point of origin. "What happened 6 years ago?" she asked. The room arranged itself around the question. He didn't answer immediately. This was not avoidance. She could feel the difference. This was the time it takes to find language for something that has been surviving without language for a long time. "Someone I was responsible for," he said finally, "died in a way that I believe, correctly or not, could have been prevented if I had been present. I was not present. I was elsewhere making a decision that, at the time, was the correct professional decision." He paused. "Sleep became," he said, "a sight of something I couldn't make orderly. The way everything else was orderly. So it stopped." Then, very quietly, "Yes. Still here." Choi Byung-suk understood the message when his third financial support structure began showing fault lines by the 9th day. He was not a stupid man. He was a pragmatic one. The inquiry closed. The investigative firm received a polite communication that the commission had been suspended. The thread that had led toward Kong Dae-hyun's house simply stopped pulling. In the house itself, the rhythm adjusted. Not dramatically. The staff continued. The household ran with its usual order. Sung-jin's formal adjustment to the employment agreement was processed with the same clerical efficiency he brought to everything, and the new terms were, in their spare legal language, a recognition of a position that had no precise category. She moved through her days with the same composure. The work was the same. The corridors were the same. The supply cart, the linen rotation, the morning garden path. What was different was the quality of what happened in the East Wing study at the hours when the world had reduced itself to its essentials. Not every night. 3 nights out of 7, perhaps 4. She would come, not summoned, but in the way that things that have been established settle into being there without requiring an announcement. She would sit. He would work, or not work. Speak, or not speak. The tea was prepared most nights now, by either of them or by no one in particular. The components had been incorporated into the kitchen's permanent stock without ceremony. He slept more. Not completely. Not without interruption. But the incremental return of something he'd stopped expecting. She watched it the way she watched things she cared about, quietly without pointing at it, letting it be real without requiring it to be announced. He watched her too. She'd known he watched her. From the first week, the awareness of his attention was something she'd registered with the careful accuracy she brought to reading environments. Now, when she felt it, she didn't look away from it or pretend it wasn't there. She simply looked back. And they were both present in the room with what had become, without resolution or declaration, something that carried its own gravity. The last thing happened on a Thursday, in the 8th week. She was in the East Courtyard, one of the days she'd been cleared for the outdoor maintenance near that section, when she heard the voices. 2 men she didn't know, speaking too quietly for the content to be clear, arrived through the side entrance. She was partially concealed by the courtyard's stone structure. They didn't see her. She didn't see their faces fully, but she saw one thing. The hand of the larger man, and the object in it, which was a particular kind of object that her time in Lagos had taught her to identify with reliable accuracy. She moved without hesitation toward the interior door. Dae-hyun was in the study. She knocked once, not the household knock, and he was on his feet before she'd finished. She told him. Spare. Accurate. Location. Number. The object she'd identified. His face was a thing she observed with her full attention in those 3 seconds. The shift from whatever he'd been processing to the absolute cold clarity of a man in his element. This was not frightening. She had understood, from the beginning, what he was. She had made her choice about this house knowing it. The clarity in him, the competence. She did not pretend to herself that it was simple or clean, but she did not pretend it was nothing either. He was already reaching for his phone. He said one word into it. Then he looked at her. The interior corridor, he said. East to the main hall. Stay there. I know where it is, she said. He held her eyes for a moment. Zuri. Her name. Again. A different register than the other times. I need you to move now. She moved. The next 40 minutes were not something she was present for in their full form. She was in the main hall, which was sealed and occupied by 2 of the household's internal security members. She heard very little. The house absorbed it the way well-designed structures absorb things, which was without anything breaking. When it was over and Sung Jin appeared in the hall to tell her it was clear, she walked back toward the east wing with the same composure she'd maintained throughout, which cost her. She was honest with herself about this, more than she showed. The 2 men were gone. She didn't ask in what sense. Dae-hyun was in the courtyard. He was alone. His shirt carried a mark at the sleeve that told her there had been contact of some kind. He was otherwise intact. She ran through the inventory with the brisk thoroughness she applied to things that mattered and would not be admitted to. He saw her come through the door. They stood across the courtyard from each other. 20 feet, maybe. The evening had come while she wasn't looking, and the light was the blue-gray of Seoul dusk, even and diffuse. She crossed the courtyard. He watched her come. When she reached him, she stopped at a distance of perhaps 3 feet. Close. Closer than their usual register. She looked at the mark on his sleeve, then at his face. You're not hurt, she said. No. The other. Handled, he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The courtyard held them in its silence. Then she reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, not on the tattoos, on the arm itself, above the affected sleeve. She held it there. Felt his breathing. Felt him register the contact and stay, which was itself a thing he was choosing. Dae-hyun, she said. Her own use of his name, the full name, arrived in the space between them with more weight than she'd intended, or exactly the weight she'd intended, she wasn't sure. He looked at her with the eyes that she had stopped being able to characterize as merely dark and precise. There was something in them that had been there for weeks and had not been named, and the courtyard was holding its breath around it. His hand came up and covered hers on his arm. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They stood in the blue-gray evening with their hands stacked, and the city below doing its ceaseless work, and the house breathing around them in the particular silence of a structure that had been changed by what moved through it. That night, she sat beside him in the study. Not on separate ends. Closer. The couch configured differently. The distance between them a matter of inches rather than the careful measured feet of the earlier nights. Not touching, except where their shoulders were almost, but not quite, in contact. He said, "There will be more of this." "I know," she said. "This isn't a house where things become simple." "You've said that. I'm saying it again. I heard you both times," she said. He looked at the window. The city. Then at her. "I don't know how to do this," he said. Which was, she understood, the most he had offered anyone about his interior life in a very long time. The barest edge of it. But it was the truth. And it was directed at her. "You're doing it," she said. He was quiet. "The being here," she said. "That's the part you're doing. The rest comes or it doesn't." He absorbed this. Then he said, "My grandmother's tea was also chamomile-based." She looked at him. This was not what she'd expected him to say. Was it? "I didn't make the connection until the 3rd night," he said. "I'm not sure what to do with it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, you don't have to do anything with it. He looked at her. Something in his expression, the guarded, permanently composed surface, had shifted into something more textured. Not open. Not exposed. But present in a way that was different from the sealed precision she'd first encountered. Zuri, he said. Yes. He didn't continue immediately. She waited, the way she waited for everything, without pressure, without filling the space. You're still here, he said. After tonight. After all of it. Yes, she said. Why? She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Not performing the thinking. Actually considering, in the way she'd considered everything in this house, with the full attention it required. Because what's here is real, she said. I've been in houses that weren't. This one is. The difficulty of it is real. She stopped. Restarted. You are real, in a way that I had stopped expecting to find in these circumstances. And I don't walk away from real things because they're difficult. He looked at her for a long time. The lamp was burning. Outside, Seoul was doing what it always did. The house breathed in the absence of threat, in the settlement that follows a particular kind of storm. He reached over. Not her hand this time. He touched her face. One hand on her cheek, with a gentleness that was the more arresting for being clearly deliberate. The way someone touches something they are afraid of damaging. The ink on his fingers was a contrast against her skin that neither of them looked at, both of them aware of. She was very still. He held her face for a moment. Then his hand fell away. Not withdrawal. Completion. She exhaled. They sat together in the lamp-quiet room while the night arranged itself around them, and the clock moved through its unmarked hours, and Seoul held them in its enormous indifferent embrace. She did not know what came next. She was honest with herself about this. The situation had the particular instability of a thing that has become too real to stay only personal and too personal to stay only structural. The men outside tonight had been a message from a direction Dae-hyun was already tracking. There were others. The world he operated in did not simplify, did not relent, and her presence in it was, she understood, with clear eyes, a point of exposure that he had chosen with full knowledge of the cost. She had chosen with full knowledge of the cost. This was what it was. This was what it continued to be. At some point, his breathing shifted into the register she recognized. She didn't look at him directly. She watched from the edge of her vision as wakefulness released its hold on him. Slowly, in the way it had been slowly learning to do over the weeks that had remade whatever this house had been before she walked into the wrong corridor. He slept. She sat in the room for a while longer. The lamp. The window. The city. Then she turned off the lamp, the way she had the first time, and let the dark be what it was. Something that had been, apparently, waiting to be made bearable by exactly this arrangement of two people who had arrived in each other's proximity from very different distances, carrying very different versions of the same wound. She went to her room. Lay down. Looked at the ceiling. The window in her room showed the east wing. The light was off. She closed her eyes. She thought about the feel of his hand on her face, the deliberateness of it, the gentleness she hadn't anticipated from someone she had watched command rooms by the mere quality of his stillness, the ink of his fingers against her skin, the completeness of the gesture, as though it were not a beginning but the acknowledgement of something already underway. She thought about the things still in motion. Choi was handled, but Choi was not the last thing. The world he moved in was not a world that ran out of choice. The men in the courtyard tonight were gone, but their absence created the particular kind of silence that precedes rearrangement rather than resolution. She thought about what she had told him. What's here is real. She thought about whether she was prepared for what real meant in this particular architecture. She thought she was. She also knew that thinking she was and finding out were different things, and that the finding out was ahead of her in ways she couldn't fully map. These thoughts moved through her with the quiet efficiency of things that don't require panic. They were information. She catalogued them. She let them be. She slept. In the east wing, the lamp stayed off. And the man who had not slept for 6 years, the man who had built a world out of control and wakefulness and the kind of grief that doesn't argue with itself, breathed through the hours without interruption, in the dark that had become, at some unmarked point in the weeks behind them, a place he no longer had to fight his way through. Something had shifted. Not settled. Shifted, the distinction he himself had drawn weeks ago, about things that end and things that simply move into their next form. Soul turned beneath them both. The night said less than people expected. In the morning, it would require something of them. But the morning was still hours away. And for now, in the space between what had been broken and what had not yet been built, there was simply this. Two people who had arrived at the same quiet, from opposite directions, choosing to stay in it a little longer. Not safe. Not finished. But here. Here, and for the first time in 6 years, that was enough to sleep through.